Every morning, I habitually walked through the university corridors, nodding politely to colleagues and smiling reservedly at students. But that day, something felt different. I sensed an inexplicable unease, as if I anticipated that something significant was about to happen. The sound of my heels echoed loudly against the marble tiles of the corridor, resonating in the emptiness. I paused before the classroom door, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Usually, I paid little attention to the students before the lecture began, but I noticed him immediately. Mark sat in the corner, studying me with his piercing eyes. He seemed somewhat distracted, yet his gaze was so focused that it made me uneasy. "Good morning, class," I said, trying to hide the momentary nervousness that had gripped me. Mark didn't take his eyes off me, and I felt an undeniable pull, even against my will. He listened as if every word I spoke held immense importance for him. The other students occasionally glanced around, checked their phones under the desks, but not him. His attention was fixed solely on me. I began discussing Flaubert's Madame Bovary, striving to convey all the passion and anxiety hidden within the lines of the novel. Mark listened, nodding, and then raised his hand. "Professor, do you believe that Emma Bovary's choice was the only possible one?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made me pause for a moment. "I think Emma's choice was driven by her passions and dissatisfaction with life," I replied thoughtfully. "She longed for something more than what her mundane reality could offer." Mark smiled slightly, but it wasn't just any smile. It was as if he wanted to say, "I understand you more than you think." After the lecture, the students slowly began gathering their things, discussing the chapters they had read. I noticed that Mark wasn't in a hurry to leave. He remained seated at his desk, gazing out the window, as if waiting for something. I pretended to be busy gathering my papers, but in reality, I was waiting for him to speak. Finally, he approached me, and I felt a slight chill down my spine. "Do you always teach with such passion, Professor?" he finally asked, coming closer. There was a barely perceptible challenge in his voice, and I couldn't help but notice it in his gaze as well. "I try," I replied, attempting to smile. "But it also depends on the students, after all. A teacher needs inspiration, too." Mark nodded, and his eyes grew even more intense. "You inspire," he said softly, but loud enough for me to hear. I felt a slight flutter in my chest. Those words sounded as if he wasn't just talking about literature. I tried to look away, but his eyes wouldn't let me. We exchanged a few more brief remarks about the meaning of words and the interpretation of plots, but with each passing moment, I became more aware of the strange attraction forming between us. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet real. "You know," Mark said after a brief pause, "I think literature is not just words on paper. It's like a key to the souls of those who live among us but hide in the shadows." I smiled, amazed at the depth of his thought. "You're right, Mark, exactly. Literature is a mirror of life, its passions and pains." He nodded, and with a smile, opened the classroom door before leaving. When Mark finally left the room, I found myself standing there, trying to catch the last echoes of his footsteps. My heart had inexplicably begun to beat a little faster. It was absurd. He was my student, I was his professor. But his confidence and those unusual glances haunted me. I knew that my life was on the brink of change, but I had yet to realize just how profound and inevitable those changes would be. I thought our relationship would remain on the level of teacher-student. Honestly, I was hoping for that. But Mark wasn't someone who simply faded into the crowd after another lecture. On the contrary, his presence became almost tangible, as if he was gradually entering my life, filling a void I had long ignored. A week had passed since our first encounter, when I felt something had changed. Usually, students rarely approached me after class, unless they had specific questions or problems with their studies. But Mark seemed to be waiting for every opportunity to speak to me, as if he had planned what we would talk about in advance. "Professor Julia, do you have a minute?" he asked one day as I was about to leave the university building. I stopped, a bit surprised by his persistence. Of course, Mark. What would you like to talk about? I tried to maintain a professional tone, but for some reason, I was pleased that he had approached me. I wanted to show you some of my work. Your opinion is important to me, he said, pulling a thin folder with sheets of paper out of his bag. I smiled. It was rare to see students who showed such interest in creativity, especially in literature. Of course, show me, I agreed, taking the folder in my hands. I opened it and saw pages filled with text. These were his own poems and short essays. I began reading the first lines and immediately felt his words piercing through me. There was so much pain, passion, and understanding in them. I looked up and saw that he was watching my reaction closely. Did you really? Is this yours? I asked, barely hiding my admiration. He nodded, smiling slightly. Yes, I started writing a few years ago. I like expressing my thoughts on paper. Sometimes it helps me understand myself, he replied, lowering his gaze slightly. This is very profound, Mark. You have an incredible gift. Your words. It's as if they touch something inside, I said, feeling that my words sounded too emotional. He bowed his head in gratitude. I'm glad you think so, Professor. Perhaps you could help me improve some of them. Your opinion would be very valuable to me. I felt that this request was not as simple as it seemed, but something in his voice, in his eyes, made me agree. Of course, Mark. We can discuss them after the next lecture if that works for you. He smiled. That would be wonderful. Thank you. From that day on, our conversations became more frequent. He began staying after lectures more often, asking me questions about literature, life, and my views on creativity. Sometimes we would meet at the university during breaks between classes, and each time I noticed that he was eager to spend more time with me. One day, he suggested we meet at the university cafe to discuss his latest work. It'll just be a conversation about poems, he said, noticing my slight hesitation. I'm sure you'll find it interesting too. I agreed. That day, I arrived at the cafe a little early, trying to understand why I had agreed. Perhaps it was because of his unique perspective on the world, or maybe it was because I lacked communication on a deeper level than the usual conversations with colleagues. When he walked in, I felt a strange excitement. He ordered coffee and sat across from me, his eyes shining with a particular gleam. I'm glad you came, he said, handing me a few more pages of his poems. I began reading, and he watched me, his gaze intent but not burdensome. This was a different kind of communication, more open, more honest. We started talking about his poems, what inspired him, and how he saw the world. Why did you choose these particular themes? I asked, trying to understand what drove his creativity. He thought for a moment before answering. Professor, I think the world is full of questions we don't have answers to. I write to find them, at least for myself. And sometimes I feel like you're searching for answers too. His words caught me off guard. I felt my heart beat faster. Me? Yes. Perhaps you're right, I admitted, surprising myself. Sometimes it feels like my whole life is a search. For something. He nodded as if he had known this for a long time. And what are you searching for, Professor? His voice was soft but insistent. I fell silent, not knowing how to answer. It was a question I didn't even know the answer to myself. I'm not sure, Mark. But maybe the answers are already close, I said, feeling a new, invisible connection forming between us. At that moment, I realized that Mark was not just a student. He was someone more. Someone who could see what others didn't notice, and someone who made me feel something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I didn't know what lay ahead for us, but I felt that our paths had crossed for a reason, and this encounter would change me more than I could have imagined. Once the class ended and the students began to disperse, I was gathering my papers, pretending to be focused on the task. But in reality, I was waiting for Mark to approach. In the past few weeks, Our interactions had become almost ritualistic, and each time I felt that something new, something dangerous, was brewing between us. Julia! He called me by name softly, and there was an uncertainty in his voice that was uncharacteristic of him before. I looked up and saw him standing by his desk, as if debating whether to come closer. I gestured for him to approach, trying to keep a neutral expression. Mark, did you want to discuss something? I asked, trying to appear calm, though my heart was pounding in my chest so hard that I feared he might hear it. He stepped closer, and I felt his presence. A tense silence hung in the air. I need to talk to you about something important, he began, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear us. Of course. We can discuss it right now, I replied, still trying to appear calm, but my palms were sweating and I couldn't understand why. He took another step, and now only a few paces separated us. I could feel his breath. His eyes were locked on mine, and in them, I saw determination and something else, something that made me forget where I was. Julia, I have to tell you something. His voice was muffled and nervous. I can't hide it anymore. Since I met you, I feel something that I can't explain. It goes beyond mere interest or respect. My fingers trembled, and I dropped the papers I was holding. I thought I had misheard. Mark, you do understand what you're saying, don't you? I asked, though deep down I already knew where this was headed. He nodded, not taking his eyes off me. I know how it sounds, but I can't deny my feelings. And I think you feel the same. His words were quiet, but there was a firmness in them that I couldn't look away from. Mark, this is wrong, I began, but the words stuck in my throat. You're my student. I'm married. He interrupted me, but not rudely, with an incomprehensible patience. I know, and I understand that this might be unwise, but I feel I must be honest, with you and with myself. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was stand there, listening and feeling my heart racing in my chest. I can't promise that nothing will change after I say this, he continued, but I can't pretend any longer. When I'm with you, I feel alive, real. I feel that you understand me like no one else. Those words burned me like fire. I tried to tell myself that this was just a young man's infatuation, that it would pass, but something inside me suggested that it wasn't that simple. Mark took another step closer, and now he was so near that I could catch his scent, a faint smell of the sea breeze and something fresh, youthful. Mark, we can't. But before I could finish, he leaned in and touched my lips with his. It all happened so quickly that I didn't have time to process what was happening. His lips were warm, soft, and for a moment, the world stopped. I didn't pull away, didn't protest. Instead, I let the moment happen, feeling a shiver run through my body. When we finally parted, I stood there, stunned. I couldn't believe what had just happened. His gaze was insistent and confident, but I saw a question in his eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered, as if realizing that he had crossed a line. I didn't mean to, but I knew he had meant to, and I knew that I had wanted it too. But it was wrong. It was against all the rules, against everything I believed in. This shouldn't have happened, I said, trying to regain control. I don't know what came over me. But deep down, I knew. That kiss, that minute, that moment, it was everything I had feared, but at the same time, everything I had wanted. That kiss changed everything. I stood at a crossroads, and at that moment, I realized that my life would never be the same. This was the point of no return, and I had no idea where this path would lead me. In the following days, I did everything possible to avoid Mark. I tried to finish classes early and not linger in the classroom, avoided looking in his direction if he was nearby. I even changed my schedule to minimize the chance of running into him. But Mark didn't give up. He started sending me emails, messages asking about his work, always teetering on the edge between professional and personal. One such message arrived late in the evening. Julia, I know you're avoiding me, and I understand why. But I can't stop. I need to see you, need to talk to you. Please come to the poetry reading on Friday. It's important to me. Mark. I stared at the screen for a long time, not knowing how to respond. My first thought was to ignore his message, but something inside me resisted this decision. Mark was right. I was avoiding him, and maybe that was wise. But my intuition told me that avoidance wouldn't solve the problem. The next morning, I sent him a brief reply. Okay, I'll come. Julia. Friday evening arrived faster than I had expected. I couldn't focus all day. My thoughts kept wandering to the upcoming meeting. What was I hoping to find there? Why did I agree to this invitation if I knew it would only complicate things? I arrived at the small literary cafe a bit earlier than the appointed time. Inside, it was cozy, with dim lighting creating an intimate atmosphere. People were settling in at tables, quietly chatting and waiting for the reading to begin. I noticed Mark sitting in the corner of the room, and our eyes met. He smiled, but I quickly looked away, trying to maintain my composure. The poetry reading began, and the first participants took the stage, reciting their works. I listened half-heartedly, trying to focus on the words, but all I could hear was the beating of my own heart. When it was Mark's turn, I felt the tension in the air become almost unbearable. He stepped onto the stage, holding several sheets of paper. I noticed him cast a brief glance in my direction, and I felt uneasy. Ah, this poem is dedicated to someone who made me see the world differently, he began, and his words pierced my chest like a knife. To someone who showed me that sometimes, to find yourself, you need to lose everything you thought you knew about yourself. His voice was deep and confident, and with each line he read, I felt a sensation akin to panic wash over me. His words were filled with passion, desire, and something else, something I was afraid to even admit to myself. When Mark finished, the room erupted in applause, but I barely heard it. I was trying to calm the trembling in my hands as he walked towards me. Thank you for coming, he said, sitting down next to me. It means a lot to me. It was beautiful, I replied, struggling to find the right words. But Mark, we can't continue like this. You understand that, don't you? He looked at me intently, not averting his gaze. I understand, Julia. But I can't just let this go. I can't let you go. His words sounded so sincere, so open, that I felt my convictions beginning to crack. We both know this is wrong, I said quietly, trying to remain calm. I'm married, and you're my student. We can't have any kind of relationship. It's not that simple, he replied. Do you think you can just ignore what you're feeling? I can't. I can't ignore what's happening between us. I felt something tighten inside me. He was telling the truth. I had tried to convince myself that I could avoid this, that it was just a temporary infatuation, but every word he said, every look, only intensified my internal struggle. We sat in silence for a few moments, and then Mark took my hand. I wanted to pull it away, but I couldn't. His touch was so gentle and assured that for a moment, my fears disappeared. Just for a moment. At least let me talk to you, Julia, he whispered. I'm not asking for anything more. I sighed, feeling my resistance begin to melt away. Okay, I said softly, feeling myself surrender. But this doesn't change anything. We can't. I know, he interrupted, but I just want to be near you, to hear you, to see you. Is that so wrong? I fell silent. I didn't know how to respond. All I knew was that I had already gone too far and that there seemed to be no way back. That evening left me with more questions than answers. I was trapped in the snare of my own emotions and couldn't find a way out. Something inside me had changed, and I didn't know if I would ever be able to return to my old life. We began meeting secretly. The first encounters were awkward, almost accidental. At first, they were short conversations after classes, prolonged discussions about his poems that lasted longer than necessary. We found secluded spots on campus where we could hide from prying eyes. In those moments, I felt the world narrowing down to one thing: Mark. And he knew it. Each meeting was filled with tension. We spoke quietly, almost in whispers, afraid that someone might overhear. But that only made everything more thrilling, almost forbidden. It was as if we were playing a dangerous game, writing the rules ourselves, knowing we could lose everything. One evening, as we sat in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city where no one knew us, Mark suddenly took my hand and said, "Julia, I can't do this anymore. These secret meetings are driving me crazy. I want to be with you for real." I felt a shiver run through my body. His words, his certainty, his desire. It all scared me and lured me in at the same time. "Mark, do you understand what you're asking? It's not as simple as you think. I have a family, a husband, a job. I can't destroy all of that for, for us," he interrupted. His eyes gleamed in the dim light of the lamp. "Julia, I understand that it's difficult, but isn't it worth the risk for what we feel?" I tried to look away, but his words stuck in my mind. "For what we feel?" I didn't know how to respond. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and any move I made could be my last. With each meeting, he became more persistent. He wasn't just trying to understand my feelings, but to convince me to make a choice. I knew I was playing a dangerous game. I knew that every encounter was raising the stakes higher and higher. "I can't do this anymore," he said one day when we met in a park outside the city. "I need more than this. I want to be with you, Julia. For real." "Mark, I don't know," I whispered, feeling anxiety grow inside me. "It's not easy. You don't understand what you're asking." He moved closer to me, and I felt his warmth. His eyes were filled with a passion that I feared but couldn't resist. "I understand, Julia, but I can't stop, and I don't want to." We stood there, facing each other, as if time had stopped. His hand reached out to my cheek, and I felt his touch, soft, gentle. My soul screamed that I needed to stop, to leave, to forget all of this. But my body remained still. In that moment, I realized I couldn't return to my old life. Even if I wanted to, even if I knew it was right, that it was necessary, I was already too far gone. We locked eyes, and I knew I could no longer avoid him. His presence had become a part of me, like the air I breathed. "Mark, this is destroying me," I said, my voice trembling as I spoke. "I don't know what to do. I'm so confused." He pulled me into an embrace, and I felt my resistance melt away. His lips came closer to mine, and I felt that kiss again. A kiss that was not just desire, but something more than I could have imagined. With each meeting, I realized more and more that I couldn't stop. I knew I was jeopardizing my career, my reputation, my family. But as soon as Mark was near, all those thoughts vanished. There was only him. One day, he approached me after a lecture, when all the students had already left. He was holding his poems, but his expression was serious, almost threatening. "Julia, I can't do this anymore," he said bluntly. "You have to make a choice." I froze, not knowing how to react. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling my heart begin to race. "You have to choose between me and your old life," he said, his voice firm and determined. "I don't want to be your secret. I want to be your reality." Those words struck me like lightning. I knew he was right. I knew I had to make a choice, but that choice seemed impossible. "Mark, I don't know how," I whispered, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. He reached out and gently touched my cheek. "Then decide, Julia," he said, his voice softening, but still insistent. But I can't wait forever. I knew he was right. I knew this moment was inevitable. And though my head told me one thing, my heart was screaming something entirely different. I stood before a choice that threatened to destroy everything I had built. But could I go back? If I had already come this far? I knew we were playing with fire, and I understood perfectly that everything in life comes with a price. But there was something about Mark, his irresistible desire to be close, that made me forget everything else. I saw that he wasn't giving up, and despite all my attempts to resist, my heart was beginning to surrender. The following week, Mark suggested we go away for the weekend. We were sitting in a cafe after classes when he made the proposal. Julia, we can't keep doing this. I need us to go somewhere far away where no one knows us, just to spend time together, away from all worries. I looked at him, and my mind was racing with all possible consequences. I knew this would be a line that could no longer be crossed back, and yet my heart trembled with anticipation. Where do you want to go? I asked, trying to stay calm even though everything inside me was boiling. There's a place I went to before, a small cabin by a lake, away from the city. Quiet, secluded. No one will bother us, he said with such confidence that I felt my last doubts starting to dissolve. What if someone finds out? If. No one will find out, Julia. He took my hand and looked me in the eyes. I promise. It will be our secret. I sighed, realizing the choice was already made. My life was already on the edge. Why not take one more step? All right, I said, feeling my heart beat faster. When are we going? This Friday. I'll pick you up after work. The Friday evening was cool and breezy. I stood by the university doors, watching as students rushed home. I held a small suitcase in my hands, my heart beating in rhythm with my thoughts. What am I doing? Why am I doing this? But as soon as I saw Mark's car, all doubts vanished. He arrived smiling, his face glowing with joy. Are you ready? He asked, getting out of the car and helping me put the suitcase in the trunk. Probably not, I replied with a nervous smile. But inside, I was bubbling with excitement. We drove for several hours, and the farther we got from the city, the calmer I became. It felt like all my problems and worries were left behind in that life, which now seemed so distant and unreal. When we finally arrived, I saw the small cabin surrounded by pines, overlooking the lake. It was already late, and a light mist was spreading over the water. The moonlight reflected off the dark surface of the lake, creating a mystical atmosphere. This is it, Mark said, getting out of the car and opening the cabin door. Inside, it was cozy. A small living room with a fireplace, blankets on the chairs, wooden furniture, and warm light from the lamps. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. We sat by the fireplace, warming ourselves by the fire. Mark poured warm tea into glasses and handed me one. I'm glad you agreed, he said, not taking his eyes off me. I'm surprised myself, I replied, looking into the fire. But I think I need this. He sat next to me, his shoulder brushing against mine, and I felt my whole body tense from his closeness. His hand gently touched mine, and I felt a surge of warmth. Julia, I love you, he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. I looked at him, and in his eyes, I saw a sincerity I couldn't ignore. Mark, I don't know what to say, I whispered, feeling a shiver run through me. You don't have to say anything, he said, moving closer. Just be with me. His lips touched mine, and this time I didn't pull away. I let myself sink into the moment, into his embrace, into his touch. It was more than just desire. It was a passion I hadn't felt in a long time. We stood there, in each other's arms, as if the world had ceased to exist. I felt his hands sliding down my back, his breathing growing heavier. We slowly moved to the bed, not breaking apart. I knew this was the moment everything would change, but I couldn't stop. We were consumed by the moment, forgetting everything else. I knew it was wrong, that I was risking everything I had. But at that moment, it was all that mattered. When we finally pulled away to catch our breath, I lay beside him, feeling my heart beat in sync with his. "Do you feel it?" he asked, looking into my eyes. "Yes," I whispered, smiling, "but I'm afraid." "Don't be afraid, Julia," he said, gently touching my cheek. "I'm here, and I'll never let you go." I knew this weekend had changed everything. We had crossed that line I had feared. Now, I stood before a new choice, and, more than ever, I understood that there was no turning back. Mark woke up early. He quietly got out of bed, trying not to wake me, and headed to the kitchen. Last night had been like a flash of light in the dark for both of us. My head was still spinning with thoughts and sensations, but he seemed determined to make this morning special. He started preparing breakfast, trying to be as quiet as possible. He quickly sliced some fruit and arranged it on a plate in the shape of a little smile, adding a touch of humor and lightness. Then he whisked eggs for an omelet, carefully cracking them into a bowl, adding a pinch of salt and pepper, a bit of cheese, and some fresh herbs he found in the kitchen. While the omelet was cooking on the stove, Mark brewed coffee, pouring hot water into the coffee maker and savoring the aroma that filled the kitchen. He wanted this morning to be pleasant for me, to make me feel special. He saw how I had struggled with doubts and knew I needed something to help me relax and feel safe. Once he finished preparing everything, he carefully arranged it on a tray. A plate with the omelet, fresh fruit, honey toast, and a steaming cup of coffee. He looked at it, smiled as if satisfied with his work, and quietly headed to the bedroom. When he entered, I was still asleep. I lay on my side, my hair scattered across the pillow, my face peaceful and serene. Mark paused for a moment, just looking at me. He moved closer, set the tray on the bedside table, and sat on the edge of the bed. His heart was racing. He gently leaned in and softly touched his lips to mine. I felt his touch first in my dream, and then awake. It was a tender kiss, barely perceptible, but it woke me like a light breeze brushing my face. I opened my eyes and saw him, his warm smile, his eyes filled with care and tenderness. My heart fluttered when I realized it wasn't just a dream, that he was truly here, and that he had made this gesture for me. "Good morning," he whispered, smiling gently. "Good morning," I replied, smiling back, feeling my cheeks flush. "I made you breakfast," he said, pointing to the tray. "I thought you might like it." "That's so sweet," I whispered, still amazed by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you." He leaned in again and kissed me, this time a bit more insistently. His lips were warm, and his touch was soft and confident. I felt a wave of warmth rush through my body. Suddenly, all my doubts and fears melted away, leaving only a pure sense of happiness. I reached out to him, wrapping my arms around his neck, and responded to the kiss with the same desire I had felt the night before. Our lips merged in a kiss that felt endless. I felt his hands sliding gently down my back, pulling me closer, and my resolve to keep my distance quickly dissipated. He was so close, his breath warm against my skin, and I realized that with each passing moment, I was becoming more attached to him. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was something deeper that made my heart race, as if it were trying to catch up with time. "Mark," I whispered, when we finally pulled away to catch our breath. "I don't know what's happening to me. I shouldn't be feeling this, but—" He smiled, gently touching my face. "You're feeling the same thing I am," he said. "It's more than just attraction, Julia. We're connected by something that's hard to put into words." I nodded, feeling tears well up in my eyes. I didn't know what to say. I understood that I was already too deep into this to go back. I was caught in the trap of my own feelings, and now all I wanted was to be with him, despite all the risks and dangers. "I don't know how I'll go on," I whispered, "but I know one thing. I can't be without you." His gaze softened, and he held me close. "Then don't leave," he whispered back, holding me tighter. "Stay with me." In that moment, I realized that I could no longer return to my old life. Everything was too deep, too serious, and there was no going back. I felt trapped by my own heart, and more than ever, I was afraid of what lay ahead. We drove back to the city in silence. Mark was behind the wheel, his gaze fixed on the road, but I could sense he was deep in thought. My mind was a whirlwind, as if I was lost in my own emotions, not knowing where to find a way out. Finally, he spoke. "Julia, we can't keep going like this," he said, without taking his eyes off the road. "If I really mean something to you, you need to talk to him." His words were firm, but there was also a softness, as if he understood how difficult it was for me to make this decision. I nodded silently, feeling a shiver run through me. "I understand," I replied quietly, unable to lift my eyes. "But it's not as simple as it seems." He glanced at me briefly, then focused on the road again. "I'm not saying it's easy, but we can't hide forever. If you really want to be with me, you need to be honest. With him and with yourself." I knew he was right. I couldn't keep living a double life. But the thought of confessing to my husband churned my stomach. I was afraid of his reaction, afraid that I would destroy everything we had. Yet, at the same time, I understood that I had already made my choice. When we reached the city, Mark stopped the car in front of my house and turned to me. "I'll wait," he said gently. "But I don't want to be your secret. You need to decide what you want." I nodded, trying to gather my thoughts. I'll try," I answered, feeling my hands start to tremble. I got out of the car and headed to the house. My heart raced. Thoughts were tangled. As I entered, I was greeted by the familiar smell, the smell of home that I had once loved, but now seemed foreign, almost hostile. My husband was sitting in the living room, reading the newspaper. He looked up and smiled at me. "Hi, honey. How was your weekend?" he asked, with the usual concern in his voice. I froze for a moment, feeling the lump in my throat. How could I tell him? How could I explain that I had fallen for another man? "Hi," I said quietly, trying to appear calm. "We need to talk." His smile instantly vanished. He put down the newspaper, frowned, and looked at me more intently, anxiety in his eyes. "Of course. What's wrong?" he asked, and I heard the tension in his voice. I took a deep breath, feeling my hands start to shake. How could I tell the person I had spent so many years with that I no longer wanted to be with him? I I have to tell you something," I started, trying to find the right words. "I've met someone else." He jumped up abruptly, his face turning red with anger, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was silent for a few seconds, as if he couldn't believe what he had heard. "You're joking, right?" he finally asked, but his voice was more filled with rage than surprise. "You're saying you have someone else?" "Yes," I whispered, unable to look him in the eye. "I love another person." He closed his eyes as if trying to contain a flood of emotions, but soon his face contorted with rage. "Have you lost your mind, Julia?" he shouted, his voice filled with fury. "What the hell? How long has this been going on?" "A few months," I confessed, tears welling up in my eyes. "I didn't want it to happen like this, but I can't lie anymore." He slammed his fist on the table, his face twisted with anger. "You're telling me you've spent all these months with someone else while I worked my ass off for our family?" He began pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "How could you? How could you betray me like this?" I I don't know," I answered, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to hurt me?" he interrupted, his voice trembling with rage. "You've already done that, Julia. You've already destroyed everything." He fell silent for a moment, his breathing heavy as if he had just run a marathon. "What now? What do you want from me?" he asked, clenching his fists. "A divorce." "Yes," I whispered, barely holding back sobs. "I think we need to get a divorce. I can't keep living like this." His face paled with rage, and he stepped closer to me. You want a divorce? After everything I've done for you, you want a divorce? His voice became almost threatening. So this is how our story ends? I stood before him, trembling with fear and guilt, but I knew there was no turning back. I. I love him, I whispered, knowing that it would only deepen his pain. He looked at me, his eyes burning with anger and hurt. Get out of my house, he said, his voice quiet but laced with menace. Pack your things and get the hell out. You're no longer my wife. I felt my whole body constrict with pain and fear, but I knew I had done what I had to do. There was no turning back now, only moving forward, toward a new, uncertain life with Mark. But I understood that the feeling of loss and guilt would stay with me forever. I made a choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. I left, knowing I had destroyed not just my marriage, but a part of myself as well. Our first days together were filled with excitement and anticipation. We rented a small apartment in the city center, bright and cozy, with huge windows that let in streams of sunlight. Every day started with smiles, morning coffee, and conversations that lasted late into the night. We cherished every moment together, as if making up for all the time we had spent apart. Mark turned out to be incredibly caring. He would surprise me with little things, bouquets of wildflowers, favorite books, or even just notes with tender words that I would find in unexpected places. He often prepared breakfast in the mornings, offering me to try new dishes, and would laugh when I wrinkled my nose at something unfamiliar. We spent our evenings on long walks around the city, discussing books, movies, ideas, and plans for the future. He loved taking me to small cafes and galleries where we would discover something new. He was full of energy, and that energy was contagious. With him, I felt alive, full of desires and hopes. One day, while we were sitting on the roof of our building, admiring the stars, he quietly said, "I'm so happy you're here." I smiled and replied, "So am I. It feels like I've only just started really living." Mark embraced me, and I felt his warmth fill my entire being. I knew I had made the right choice. With each passing day, I became more convinced of this. He was the one who could understand me, support me in difficult moments, and share in my joy. We began making plans for the future. We talked about traveling, about creating something new together. He supported me in my search for a new job, always finding encouraging words when I felt lost. And soon, I found myself again. I found a job that brought me joy and fulfillment. Together, we were creating a new space, a new life. Sometimes it was hard. Like in any relationship, we faced challenges and misunderstandings. But every difficulty only made us stronger. We learned to listen to each other, to find compromises, and to respect each other's desires and needs. I saw how Mark grew and developed beside me, how his creativity blossomed. We became a source of inspiration for each other. I began writing again, as if my heart was filled with new ideas and emotions. He often read my drafts, made notes, and gave advice, and I felt our lives intertwining more and more. Every day we found new reasons to smile and laugh. Mark turned out to be the person with whom I could be myself, without fear of judgment or misunderstanding. With him, I felt free and loved, as if all the walls I had once built around my heart were starting to crumble. One evening, as we were having dinner on the balcony, Mark looked at me with a special expression in his eyes. "I want to be with you forever," he said, and there was so much sincerity and warmth in his voice that my heart ached. I smiled and replied, "So do I. You've become everything I was looking for." He took my hand and squeezed it tightly, and I felt happiness fill me from within. Our life together turned out to be not only possible, but full of love, respect, and understanding. We supported each other, learned to be patient and attentive. We became true partners who could overcome any difficulty. Now I knew that love is not only passion and attraction, but also the ability to listen, understand, trust, and forgive. I didn't regret my decision, because thanks to it, I found someone who made my life fuller and happier. I didn't know what the future held for us, but now I was sure I was ready for any challenges as long as Mark was by my side. We were building our life together, confident that our love could overcome any obstacles, and that was the most important thing for me.